enkele praktische mededelingen voor jullie. Gezien jullie talrijke opkomst wordt dit interview ook live gestreamd. Bij deze dan ook een hartelijk welkom aan de kijkers thuis. Alle besproken boeken zijn na afloop te koop en Graig Thompson zal ook signeren. Mensen die net al een boek gekocht hebben, kunnen zelfs ook langsgaan voor een handtekening. Op het einde van dit interview krijgen jullie ook allemaal een BOEKTOPIA boekenbon ter waarde van €10. Deze boekenbon is alleen geldig in de boekhandel en kan dus niet gebruikt worden bij de boekenverkoop in onze foyer. Zometeen laat ik jullie achter in de kundige handen van journalist Snoekx, jullie host voor vanmiddag. En dan schakel ik eventjes over naar het Engels. As for now, the only thing for me to do is call our guests on stage and wish you all a very interesting afternoon. Please welcome Snoekx and Graig Thompson.
What an entrance, right? Hi, welcome everyone. I'm trying to do my best at English, so if you can't understand something, just raise your hand and I'll try and clarify. But I'm delighted you could all join us for this talk with Graig Thompson. As you all know, Graig is an American graphic novelist whose work, consisting of the graphic novels Goodbye Chunky Rice, Blankets, Garnet Voyage, Habibi, Space Dumplings, and very recently the 12-part series, soon to be published as a graphic novel in English as well, following spring. Ginseng Roots has gained him multiple Harvey, Ignatz, and Eisner awards, as well as a warm embrace of readers all over the world. 21 years ago, his superb Blankets ended with the words, "How satisfying it is to leave a mark on a blank surface, to make a map of my movement, no matter how temporary." I can only say that satisfying is a word that falls short when describing how his marks on the blank surface of the page have impacted his readers. His work touches upon life, love, passion, religion, pain, roots, future, art, work, loss, memory, and so much more. And does so in the most thoughtful, lived, vibrant, gorgeous, deeply human, brutally honest, funny, touching, daring, and genre-defining way. The maps of his movements reach far beyond the temporary, and yet that kind of fleeting moment is all we have this afternoon. So let's not waste any time. Now that I've spilled my vague words, I invite you to discover and explore the world of Graig Thompson.
Dang, thank you. Thank you, Kurt. Very generous.
We gathered here today to talk especially about ginseng roots. I should keep track of.
Yeah, ginseng roots, which is
coming. No, I don't think it's.
And as Kurt was mentioning, it's not out in Dutch yet. I don't know what's happening with Dutch rights. It's not out in English until April of next year, but it is a series right now in English, so we have those.
Yeah. It's a book about the medicinal herb, a root called ginseng. I'll try and ask this. From the first pages, the reader can gather that it goes far beyond that it isn't in fact just about the root, because also ginseng in Chinese, I think, means human root, because of its humanoid shape with roots that are not fixed to the ground. It is a root that runs, in fact. Graig, could you maybe first explain what it is that inspired you to make a book about ginseng?
Yes, and I'll explain what ginseng is to a broader audience too, because I feel like it's pretty well recognized in the Eastern world, but at least in the United States and perhaps in Belgium, it's not very obvious. It's a medicinal plant prized in Chinese medicine. Perhaps one of the second most prized and powerful herbs in Chinese medicine. Widely valued, consumed, treasured in Asia. But a lot of Westerners aren't familiar with it. And I guess you'll probably be asking me this in a minute, but the tiny town I grew up in America, which is rural America in the Midwest, population 1,200 people, was the biggest producer of cultivated American ginseng in the world when I was a kid. So this surprises a lot of people. Yep. And you mentioned the Chinese character. I'm always looking for examples of comics that exist outside of comics. I'm always looking for visual inspiration outside of comics. And just the simple character for ginseng alone in Chinese inspired me. You can see it in the lower left-hand corner. And if you just take the right side of that character, the left side is the character for humanity. Mm-hmm. And you'll see it repeated on the right in the character for ginseng. At the top is 3 triangles that represent stars, the heavens. At the bottom are 3 lines or stripes or hairs that represent roots digging into the earth. And then in the middle is the character for humanity. So you have the whole like cosmic like narrative of earth, heavens, and humanity in the middle within that character. Yeah. It's a complete story. So why did I draw a book about it? It's already told there. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of ironic that, or is it a coincidence that the human root or the root that runs heads to marathon to become this kind of story that you create?
Yeah, truth is stranger than fiction. You would think I would make up the name Marathon for my hometown based on this story of a plant that's anthropomorphized, both in its character but also in Chinese mythology. So again, this little cartoon character on the right end of the frame. It's not really an original idea on my part because in Chinese mythology, there's hundreds of stories of the little ginseng root coming alive, trying to run away and evade hunters. There's this expression, real ginseng runs. So it's completely appropriate that my hometown is also a reference to running a marathon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which drawing a graphic novel is sort of its own form of a marathon.
Yeah. You already mentioned Marathon, Wisconsin, 1,200 inhabitants when the story takes place. Your work always testifies to a giant atmosphere. I mean, in Blankets as well, it's kind of a space, it's a time as well. Could you kind of tag us along to that place and explain what it is, or what that space and time really was like living there?
Oh, I hated growing up there. You know, it was that suffocating small town feeling. You know, I was always the littlest, scrawniest kid, especially amongst all these burly farmhand types. You know, I was the outsider. I was bullied. I kind of unpack a lot of that trauma in Blankets. So as a kid, my dream was always escaping, getting as far away as possible from this little town. And that is what I did as soon as I, you know, had some autonomy. At age 21, I moved to the West Coast of America, and that's where I've lived ever since. So one could say that I've spent my whole life and career running away from where I came from, and then I reached this point in life, midlife, mid-career, where I had to kind of reconcile these things and my feelings about that space.
Yeah. And really, in fact, head back to the roots, because this story, in part, takes place when you were a child. I believe you were 10 or 11. Who do we see here?
Oh, yeah. So, well, can I jump around a little? Yeah. When I started the project, I wanted to write a book about plants. That was the principal motivation, to tell a story with plants at the center of the narrative. And when I was meditating on what plant I had any knowledge of, I remembered that I spent 10 years of my childhood working in ginseng. Once I started researching ginseng, it became infinitely fascinating to me as a springboard to explore a lot of different themes, which we'll probably talk about in your interview. But when I told people what I was starting to work on, I could see them already getting bored because it was plants, it was agriculture, it was nonfiction, it was history, boring, boring, boring. Until I would tell them like, oh, but when I was 10 years old, which is what I'm trying to depict there, I was working 40 hours a week in the summer in ginseng agriculture, along with my brother, who was 7, and my mother. So like my mother always had summer jobs, and once we were old enough to join her, we joined her because that meant we had money of our own. Mm-hmm. And when we started, my brother and I were getting paid $1 an hour, and that translated to 1 comic book an hour for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't think I would be a cartoonist today if it weren't for doing this work. I wouldn't have had that disposable income growing up working class to buy and read comics.
Yeah. What was the work like? What did you have to do?
So in this image, we're just weeding the gardens, which is easy enough for anybody who has a garden in their backyard. You pick some weeds to help the plants survive. But ginseng gardens, the smallest garden is the size of an American football field, 1 acre. And so it would take us like at least a week to weed an entire garden, and by the time you finished, all the weeds have come back. So it's just a cycle you do nonstop all summer long, especially because you're jumping from one garden to the next. It's just every day, 8 hours. You get up at 5 in the morning before it gets too hot outside, and you just pick weeds out of these giant gardens on your knees.
Yeah. There was also this.
Oh yeah, and this is even becomes before that process. And this we enjoyed a lot more, rock picking. There's actually a panel in Blankets that alludes to rock picking, so that's a good Easter egg for people who have read Blankets to see if they can find the rock picking panel. But before you can plant the crop, you have to go through the field and remove as many rocks as possible. Not really for the plant, it's for the equipment, because it will damage all the planters and plows as they go through the fields. And it has to be done by hand, apparently. And so as like little boys, this was pretty fun work for us, to run behind the tractor, filling up a wagon with rocks from the field. It was much more exciting, less slow and boring and passive than sitting and meticulously weeding.
Yeah. But it was real work. During the holidays, 40-hour weeks.
Holidays, I feel like, is a European concept.
Or, yeah, summer holiday.
Yeah, we had some quote-unquote summer vacation, 3 months off of school, but we just worked full-time during those. And my father got 1 paid week off a year. So like the family took one week off a year to usually go stay at his boss's cabin on a lake.
Yeah, I think here there is mention, and we can see someone else above. So in the middle, in the couch, in the middle, that's Graig. To the right of him is his brother Phil, and to the left, there's someone we're going to meet later on as well.
Should I reveal or wait?
No, you can already say who this is.
It's my sister.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's only funny because if you've read Blankets, my sister is not present in Blankets. And there's a few reasons for that. One is when I started Blankets, I was age 23. I was trying to change all the details. But as I got deeper into the writing, it became more and more pure autobio. But my sister, in fact, was not a huge part of my childhood. Everything for me was about my brother. We were best friends. We shared all the same interests and activities. My sister talks about this. In fact, she felt very left out. She was the middle child. She was a girl. We lived in the middle of nowhere. We weren't allowed to socialize with people that didn't belong to our church. So she had an extremely isolated childhood. And but when I was working on Blankets, I told her, like, hey, I'm doing this book. It's about our family, only you're not in there. And she was relieved. She's like, oh, good, then I have nothing to worry about. But I don't know if that's entirely true, because now, 20 years later, I included my sister in the conversation, and we sort of address that and amend that in Ginseng Roots. She becomes a character. We talk about her omission from blankets. And my sister was maybe the biggest resource on the book. Because when I started writing the book, I started with my own memories. Then I reached out to my siblings. I thought the book was going to be about working in the gardens with my mom and brother, because I'd forgotten that my sister ever did the work. Because she only did it for a year or two, and she hated it so much, she extracted herself and did babysitting instead. Yeah. And so my sister started reminding me, like, no, I did the work too. And here's and her memories and observations were clearer than anyone else in my family. I think she has the best recollection of everyone in the family.
Yeah. So you discuss the fact of, or you discuss with the people in your books that you're going to include them, or you ask them, can I include you?
Oh, yes.
And so on. Did you ever struggle with that autobiographical genre, with including people? Did you ever struggle with turning the eye inward and really talking about your life?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the first big problem of autobio, is it's easy enough to write about yourself and your experiences and feelings, but it's really delicate territory when it includes other people, as it always does. And how do you represent them and their versions of the story? This is also addressed in Ginseng Roots, because right away, in my family of 5 people, we all had different variations on the same memories. So there is no consistent narrative. With blankets, I was rebuilding it from my own memory. It was more of an emotional memoir. This is more of a documentary where every line of dialogue that's in a word balloon is recorded and then transcribed. And then I show it to the people I interviewed to get their approval or edits before it goes to press. So everyone was much more involved, it was much more collaborative, and it did make me a lot more nervous. Because like if someone didn't approve of something, and I didn't want it watered down by everybody's opinions, but I don't think it was.
Okay. Yeah. This is also part of Ginseng Roots, where Graig is confronted with a ginseng root, saying that making comics is not real work, as he would know from his childhood, picking rocks and so on. Is that something you think about, growing up and having spent your time in Marathon, Wisconsin, in that typical environment, and then becoming a comic book artist?
Well, again, I grew up very working class. I never went to university, so I don't have any educational background. And I have 2 kinds of insecurity. One is because I do this indoor creative work, I'm not doing actual work, because I grew up around people that did backbreaking labor, exposed to the elements of outdoors. I didn't know white-collar people as a child other than school teachers. So there is a little bit of guilt associated with the comfort of the job I get to do, the privilege of it. Also, I have insecurity because I now get to talk on stage. I get to inhabit academic circles, artistic, cultural circles, where I have a very strong imposter syndrome because I don't have any educational or cultural background. Before this project, I thought that I had no culture of my own.
Yeah, I think you went to college for about 6 months or something, or art college.
Yeah, I went for 5 months, 1 semester, and I ran down of money. Yeah. That's all I could afford. Yeah. Of course, I've been speaking in schools in Belgium actually, and obviously schooling is much more affordable in Europe. That school in the 1990s was $25,000 a year. Now it's $50,000. I was paying for it with my own money that I earned working in ginseng, and I could only afford 5 months. And so I was just forced financially to drop out of school. Mm-hmm. Also, I mean, I also didn't feel like I had a place in art school. This is a thing I talked with students about yesterday.
Yeah.
Because I talked at the Luca in Brussels, and they have comics program there. Those things didn't exist in the 90s. And I don't think any teacher knew it, except for my English teacher. Nobody knew what to make of me, this guy who wanted to make comics. That wasn't a thing in the 1990s in art school.
I think there are a lot of things coinciding in Ginseng Roots as well. You talk about when you start working, that you get $1 for every hour you work. That $1 also means a comic book. So it kind of coincides, which is a beautiful thing in the Ginseng Roots series, that you kind of get this story of ginseng, but you also get the story of a kid who enjoys drawing, kind of growing up and seeing, well, what do I make of this? Can I create comic books? The meaning of those comic books as well. Ginseng Roots in itself is a 12-part series, documentary, non-fiction. It's a long way from where comic books entered your life. What were the kind of books you read as a child? You bought with those $1.
Yeah, well, I can get to that question, but I just had a thought about a frame you showed like 3 panels ago, which is about kind of midlife crisis. One more? 2 more? No, there it is.
This one, yeah.
This book, happened in a moment of midlife crisis too. I've been doing graphic novels for 20 years now, and it's become a job like any other. It was a job that I was no longer enjoying for many reasons, which I depict in the series, including the hand health crisis. And one of the motivations to work in this serialized comic book format, it was a new challenge. I've never done serialized comic books, but probably more importantly, it was the format that I grew up with as a child. And so there's something very nostalgic, pure, unassuming about that format. When Blankets came out 20 years ago, graphic novels were a brand new concept in America, I think in a lot of places, and that's what I wanted to do because I was sick of the comic book format and all the plastic bags and collectors and superheroes.
Because it also implied something content-wise?
It implied that people were collecting them rather than reading the stories. And I was only interested in a book with a spine on your bookshelf that you would read and not treat like a precious plastic bag object. But now, 20 years later, there's too many graphic novels, and they're expensive, they take up a lot of space, there's a presumption about them. And I saw the comic book format as this very unassuming, disposable object that doesn't demand too much of the reader's attention or pocketbook. It's this very humble format. And so I thought that maybe working in that format would help Also, graphic novels take so long, and this one, like any other, took way too long. So I thought, if I put it out as series, I had up to 4 of them out a year. So it was just like getting stuff out there more often and not just hiding in my cave for years. Yeah,
maybe that's also interesting to the public. Like, what time do you devote to a graphic novel, something like Blankets or Habibi?
Well, I keep getting slower. Blankets I did in 4 years, and I was working full-time as an illustrator during that time. Habibi I did in something like 7 years or 6 years, but I was working on that full-time. And then this whole Ginseng Roots process took 8 years of working full-time. And it's 200 pages shorter than Habibi. So I keep slowing down with age. I think Crumb had said that comics is a young man's game. It requires your energy diminishes for that stamina, So like, if I can do little sprints of a comic book issue, rather than the whole marathon, once again, of a graphic novel, maybe that'll make it easier.
In a way, you said Ginseng Roots was a return to the comic book format that you encountered as a child. What were the books that you read? Is it all these characters here? That
Yeah, these are the major touch points. Although I guess there's... So yeah, it started with, there's Casper the Friendly Ghost there. It started with kids comics, Harvey comics, Heathcliff. There was a superhero phase. It's not represented here, but the X-Men mostly and X titles. But my brother and I were always into humor. So it was sort of like The Tick is represented there, which is a humorous superhero. Usagi Yojimbo. And then there's explosion of like black and white independent comics that happened in the 1980s, which revolved around the Ninja Turtles. You know, Calvin and Hobbes is there, and that's probably my most consistent influence throughout my whole career.
Yeah. I think you were very serious about comics in the sense that you also only distributed comic books to your brother Phil when he was ready for it. Is that right?
No, I think I was the controlling older brother. So I would buy the comics I wanted, and then I would tell him the comics he should buy so that I could read them too. So I could double my comic book consumption because I had a little brother. Yeah, here's an example of just like we shared every interest as children, but the first and most important was drawing together.
Yeah. What did that mean to you, that drawing together? What brought that about?
It probably meant escapism. Again, tracking back to that first question and growing up in this small town and growing up in a church community that was isolationist. We weren't allowed to socialize with the secular world. You know, we were truly isolated. I had a very Amish upbringing, to be honest, and there's a lot of Amish and Mennonite people in my community. And so we created worlds, an escape for ourselves on paper together. That's how we would fill up our time and our imaginations. We were lucky to grow up before the age of the internet because we were bored all the time. And so to fill up that boredom, we would draw.
Yeah, and I think the comics medium was the only art form that wasn't censored in a way.
Yeah, because it was a fundamentalist Christian family. No secular music allowed in the house, only Christian music. And then the TV and movies were censored by my parents. They would screen it first before we were allowed to watch anything. Ironically, we were allowed to watch most violent movies, all the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and Commando, and but we weren't allowed to watch anything with a hint of sexual content. But comic books, one, because we bought them with our own money, and two, because they were just perceived as a kid's medium, were below that censorship radar. They never looked at what our comic books were. So I think it was the edgiest, medium we had access to, and the most personal. And that's one of the reasons it imprinted on me.
So next to reading comic books, you start to draw as well. And that's from that perspective that you wanted to create your own worlds. In fact, what was part of those worlds? And do you think if your parents had noticed that they would have put on some form of
No, what we drew is quite innocent. I mean, I know you have a few panels of like we would get this 1980s computer paper, printer computer paper, and we used to make a lot of scrolls where we would tape, or in this case, staple the paper together to make these long, endless scrolls. I don't know if anyone can see that from the audience, but they're like snowy landscapes with all kinds of shenanigans related to winter happening, with sleds and snowball fights and snowmobiles and snowmen.
You could get quite enthusiastic about those papers. You were telling me just a few hours ago that you managed to fill an entire room with just...
Yeah, I mean, I think I have one scroll that's at least twice as long as this room. Maybe more, I don't know. I have to measure it. And I don't know meters well. But
kind of a story developing
Yeah,
on a
and
daily
their narrative
basis.
scrolls too, like, yeah. Which again also harkens to Chinese art a bit, the attachment to the scroll.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What do you think the comics medium is capable of as a contrast to other art mediums?
Well, one of the reasons, as a child I loved comics. As a high schooler, I stopped reading comic books. And because it just seemed like nerdy kid stuff to me, and I wanted to pursue cooler things. But in terms of career, I was really interested in going into animation. And by the end of high school, I was disillusioned with that idea. One, again, because I was working class and I didn't know how I could afford art school, which seemed to be the only path to entering the animation industry. But maybe worse, if I got access to the industry, I would just be a cog in the machine. I'd be the guy who was animating the snowflakes in Frozen. And I wanted to do it all. I wanted to write the story. I wanted to do the character design, the background design. And rediscovering comics allowed me access to that. Like, oh, this is one of the last visual mediums where a single person can do it all. You can't really do that in cinema and animation. So that's one thing. And then also, I think it might be the most personal visual art medium, because you see the author's handwriting both in the text and in the drawing. Especially, I mean, maybe only if you're working analog style. So there's a real intimacy, handwritten intimacy to comics that is pretty rare in our media now. And this is that like 1980s computer paper. It's recycled. So on one side, there's all these computer printouts, probably people's credit card numbers. And then we draw these detailed comics on the other side.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Someone on this tour was pointing out that there's a lot of detail in my work, and that probably comes from a working class background. The paper was so precious that we would try to cram detail into every square inch of it, or centimeter. Whereas if I grew up a little more, middle class or upper class, paper would be a free-flowing commodity, and I could just make gestural sketches and toss it aside. But no, I had to make every inch of space.
Yeah, absolutely. In Ginseng Roots, there is one moment, I think, in which your mother is talking, and it's kind of the emptiest page in the whole series.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah, empty spaces are very meaningful in your work, I want to say. Okay, so we get back here, and then that picture was part of this picture where, again, Graig's sister is introduced.
Yeah, so full circle conversation talking about how, people are always asking about blankets and if everything in there is true. And I say, yes, it's all true. But the fiction is in what was omitted, what fell onto the cutting room floor in the editing room. And the biggest of those elements, of course, is my sister.
Yeah. Here we have a few pages from Ginseng Roots where Graig's sister is explaining her take on the work on the ginseng fields and the question of being omitted from blankets.
She laughs and says, like, it would be very confusing for your readers if suddenly you have a sister.
I think so.
But I really wanted this book to be as honest as possible and to maybe address things that I saw problematic in my old work, to do my best to fix that.
Yeah. Here's the fact that your sister didn't really like working in the
Oh no, she hated ginseng. And there's an element in the book too where you mentioned this book this scene with my mother. My mother claims to have no memories of childhood, so I have no sense of what my family heritage. My parents were born-again Christians, which exists in Europe, right? Or maybe not?
I'm not sure.
Okay, maybe it certainly started in America, whereas like Europe had old world Christianity, whether that was Catholicism or Protestantism. But then in America, we had this new brand of revivalist, evangelical, born-again Christianity, which was all about erasing everything that came before you. And I mean, that's kind of what America is about in general. It was, started by immigrants that were fleeing their homeland, the trauma of their homeland, and they wanted to erase that past. And then they tried to erase the past of the people that were already inhabiting that land, the indigenous people. My parents became born-again Christians when they were in their 20s, and at that point, they divorced themselves from their families. So I didn't grow up with grandparents or cousins or an extended family, and I also had no sense of my parents' story, because my mom claimed to have no memory of that. Mm-hmm. Jesus took it away from her when he came into her heart. And my brother reveals to me, I don't know if these are spoilers, but over the course of the work that he's a little similar, genetically at least. He's like Mom, he has trouble with memory. But my sister, once again, has the best memory and recall of everyone in my family, so she became this huge resource. Also, I thought the book was going to be about my dynamic with my brother again, that I would revisit that theme. My brother was the biggest cheerleader for this project. He got a big ginseng tattoo when I decided I was going to do this book. But as the years went by, it's my sister and I who got closer. This book brought us way closer, and it probably started with amending that omission from Blankets.
Yeah.
She felt more heard and included.
Yeah. I think your brother is also still a big part of Ginseng Roots, because he even creates his own comic pages in the series.
Yeah, in fact, that's one element that makes this series better than the graphic novel. So in the US, the graphic novel doesn't come out until April. And there's a lot of new material in the graphic novel. I added something like 70 pages of narrative. So they're different. But there's a lot of elements in the series that won't exist in the graphic novel, and probably the coolest of them is my brother's pages. So with each chapter, he was doing 1 to 2 pages of his own, reflecting on his own versions of the memories. And I hope for more of that. When I started the project, I was like, well, maybe my brother will draw half of this book. It can be a true collaboration. But he's not really an obsessive drawer in the way that I am. He's still creative. He's a graphic designer, and he works in advertising. But, for him, creativity is a job. He punches the clock at 5. He doesn't need, he drew the pages he wanted to draw, and he's like, yeah, that's about all I have to say about ginseng. And so for him, it was like 12 pages or 16 pages. Yeah. But for me, it had to be 450.
Yeah. But he's also part of the journey that is Ginseng Roots.
For sure.
In fact, he takes up much.
Well, I mean, this image you're showing here is like my brother joined me for research trips, including to Asia. This is in South Korea. We went to South Korea, to Gumsam, which is considered the ginseng cultivation capital of the world. And we went to Jilin province, China, which is maybe the true epicenter, at least in terms of where ginseng is valued and consumed. And it's a hard-to-reach portion of China along the border of North Korea. Maybe no Americans ever go there, but even it's hard to get to even for Chinese people.
And that part underneath is...
Oh, that's a panel from Blankets. So yeah, this book, Ginseng Roots, begins with my brother and I sharing a bed. So there is a callback to that dynamic. Also, the ginseng gardens are called beds too, garden beds. Yeah. And that's in a hotel in China, in Jilin province.
Absolutely. And there you talk about, and this is the reason why it's really important to mention this. Comics. You mentioned comics as being a place where you feel safe from bullies, religious fundamentalism, And now it's the source, you say, of all my bullies, critics, and internet trolls. Can you elaborate a bit on what you mean by that? What episode in your life does this?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, yeah, comics were my refuge, both reading and making them. That was where I would run to hide from everything that felt oppressive to me as a child. And it was my little refuge where I could make my own little worlds, safe worlds on paper. But yeah, at this point in my career, especially over the course of this project, the 8 years it took, every single moment at the drawing board was a moment of torment. It's become a career I despised, you know, and it was mostly because of the waves of criticism that seemed constant. You know, I get hundreds of death threats a year in the U.S., and but it's also my problem, right? Psychological problem that I was internalizing that criticism, and
why was that?
It was tilling up this primal soil of bullying and religious fundamentalism as a child.
Yeah.
So it's stuff I'm still working through, but the whole course of this project was trying to process that stuff.
Yeah.
So ginseng cultivation is interesting because the plant itself, once you've grown it on a plot of land, can never grow there again. It deposits a sort of toxin in the soil that prohibits that same crop ever growing there for, they say, hundreds of years.
No.
And I was feeling similar, I think, creatively. Like something in me had grown toxic in relation to my creativity. And I didn't know how to grow anything any longer in my soil.
Yeah, yeah. What is the criticism about you mentioned here, the criticism you received? You mentioned death threats coming to you.
I mean, the criticism is endless. I don't know where to start.
Let's take ginseng roots, for example.
Okay, so yeah, that's easier. Or it's easy. Blankets had criticism from the beginning because people saw it as anti-religious. I guess it was mostly getting criticism from the right-wing religious community. Habibi was a book that got more attacked from the liberal academic community for being cultural appropriation, which I've learned is not an unfamiliar term in Europe either.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the basic premise is that it's wrong to talk about cultures not your own. I think the true definition of that word is when you're doing it disrespectfully. In fact, when I was working on Habibi, there was the Danish cartoon controversy that happened, and so that was and then not that long after, there's Charlie Hebdo killing. So there was conversations with my editor and considerations of like, is this book dangerous within that territory? But my feelings was like, no, I'm going to approach this with reverence and respect, and that's what is going to make the difference. It's not supposed to be a provocative examination of Islam. It's a very reverent exploration. But the conversation in the United States was like, no, you're just not even allowed to write about that at all because you don't come from that culture. Which again was against part of my theory, which was like, well, my theory was like, okay, we have these three Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which seem to always be in conflict with each other, ironically, because they're all essentially the same belief. Yeah. They're all monotheistic. They all have the same prophets, stories, morals. They have the same polar extremes of the casual cultural Christian or Muslim and the extremist, whether that's a jihadist or a white nationalist Christian. There's just very similar dynamics in both faiths. There's way more connections, and that's what I wanted to communicate. So my message was like, no, there aren't really. Everything is more about connection than boundaries and differences between things. But that same criticism plagued ginseng roots. As soon as the book was announced, Ginseng Roots, the American internet exploded in protest that I was repeating the same crime of writing about a culture not my own. And in this instance, I was writing about Chinese culture. And the protests were violent. I might not get into details now, but they included many death threats. I lost my publisher, I lost all my festival invites. My books were pulled off shelves. At least in the town I was living, you couldn't find my books anywhere. And I stopped drawing for 6 months. I just stopped comics. I had no desire to draw or make things. And I actually fled to Europe. I fled here too. I was here. During those 6 months off, I realized that whether I liked it or not, Ginseng Roots was an unconscious response to that criticism. And not with some direct answer, because I don't believe in black and white thinking. It was just with a question of like, well, what about, can you write about other cultures in the places where they overlap with your own cultures? Because that was exactly the experience with ginseng. It's a crop that's exported, consumed, and valued in China. But my tiny, tiny town, which was primarily white people, farmers, and factory workers, that was our agriculture. So there, you can't really extract the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like you get ginseng being farmed in Wisconsin, you also get ginseng from Wisconsin that you can find in parts of Asia as well. Mm-hmm. Also the fact that you have this whole history of working in the fields and so on. There's beautiful imagery in Ginseng Roots where Graig draws or looks at the 45th parallel, in fact just a line surrounding the globe, and kind of hits all the spots that are important to the story. And it's really amazing how much is connected, in fact. And I think Ginseng Roots, if it does one thing, it's at least it's connecting all these different stories in a very honest and earnest way. There's a lot of research going into the book. I think we have a few images I can show, but it is about Marathon, Wisconsin. It is about China. It is about Korea. It is about the Hmong people. You meet Chua, your dear friend, in Wisconsin. So it kind of interconnects the world, and that's what makes it a strange question as to, can you create something about it, because it is your story. It is not the story of you alone, but you are part of the story. So it is your every right to tell it. In fact, you'll also see, I mean, there's so much being connected within the 12-part series of the book, and a graphic novel undoubtedly as well. But
well, these images you're showing now are about the Hmong immigrant story. And again, this was an element, I could not write about Wisconsin ginseng without addressing the Hmong immigrant population. Every single farmer I interviewed said this industry would not have survived without the Hmong people. And it was a combination of, white people not being willing to do this sort of hard labor required in the fields. I mean, I guess that was the biggest element. And then at the same time, there was a new population of Hmong immigrants flooding into our community that were willing to do that work. But a lot of people don't even know who the Hmong people are, because they've never really had a homeland. It's an ethnic minority from China, but ever since the Qing dynasty, they were exiled from China. And they resettled in the mountains of Laos, this very treacherous terrain. And they were able to, that nobody else wanted to live in. They were always exiles. And then during America's war in Vietnam, the Geneva Accords established Laos as a neutral territory. But the communists, the Pathet Lao, they overstepped those accords, and they started routing the Ho Chi Minh Trail through large portions of Laos. And in retaliation, the CIA in America started enlisting a guerrilla army of tribal hills people from Laos, almost all of them Hmong, to fight for America. That was their way of recruiting fighters, but it wasn't American soldiers, so legally, gray territory. And then in a classic American fashion, when Americans pulled out of Saigon in 1975, they abandoned their allies. It was sort of like Afghanistan or Iraq all over again. Like whoever was helping Americans were just abandoned and left in these dangerous zones. So in Laos, it's like one of the longest ongoing genocides. There's still people 50 or more years later that are being killed in Laos for participating with America. But at the end of the war in the 70s, only like 3,000 people were allowed evacuation. A third of the population died then in the war, and then the rest found refuge. There were refugees that found refuge in Thailand, refugee camps, and spent 5, 10, 20 years, 30 years there before they were able to find settlement somewhere safe. And most Hmong immigrants landed in my hometown of Wausau or in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul, Minnesota is number one. It's more urban. Wausau is more rural. And those are the largest Hmong populations in the world. And so they are all flooding into the community at the same time that there was no one willing to do agricultural labor anymore. It was sort of being phased out of American culture. It's even stronger now, those sort of feelings. When I travel the world, I find it like super racist, obviously, but also, I don't know why every country thinks it's okay that immigrants do the hard work for them. That's like, oh, that's immigrant labor, White people or, the OG citizens, whatever the people think of themselves, they're like, we do, white collar, privileged labor, and then the immigrants can do the dirty work. Yeah. And whatever country you go to that exists. Of course, like in Hong Kong, it's Filipino people, like America, it's generally a Mexican population. It's a weird universal cultural racism that somehow has only gotten more strong with globalization and with digital culture. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a weird thing about work ethic shifting too, is like, we have this, during pandemic, this whole movement of quiet quitting, people examining, do I really want to do this labor? I think this labor is not appropriate for me, but it's okay if immigrants do it. It's so racist, I don't know. Yeah, yeah. And with Chua, his family story is part of issues 7 and 8. And he was also, of everyone I interviewed 80 people for this book. About a dozen of them made it into the book. Any journalist, and you're a journalist, can tell you that there's a problem that most people are not natural storytellers. So how do you take what they're telling you and shape it into a narrative? But Chua already had this beautiful story. It was like, it had a lot of heart, it had a lot of history, it had this whole immigrant dynamic, which is I realized was the real heart of what ginseng is about too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry to blabber on there for a while, but
and a big story about his father as well.
Yes.
I
mean, his father was the immigrant. Like Chua was first generation American, and it was very important for him to have like a platform to tell his father's story.
Yeah. You already mentioned all the research you put into it, interviewing a lot of people. I mean, this is just a few pages of...
Yeah, so I said I interviewed 80 people. It's all like recorded, hours and hours of dialogue that I transcribed by hand. Early on, I was looking into, using an app to transcribe, and this was, I think the apps are better now with AI, but they weren't so great then. Or do I hire someone because it's such tedious work? And Joe Sacco, who's a huge inspiration for me, said like, no, you absolutely have to transcribe it yourself. Because when you're listening to those tapes and taking the time, that's when you start to visualize the scenes, and you'll pick out a line or two that has some emotion to it, and you can see that in those pages that I use a highlighter. So I'll transcribe hundreds of pages, but then maybe only a half a page of dialogue will make it into the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also something very specific. I mean, if you're a journalist and you interview people, you also type out, well, a dozen of pages, for example, for an article of 2 pages. So you always have to skim it down. But in comic books, it's even worse. I mean, you always have to kind of make it very concise, very powerful as well, but kind of reduce. Did you find that difficult? Also, in the perspective of creating non-fiction to kind of move away from the original source material?
I learned that documentary is like the most contrived of mediums because of the amount of editing it requires. So even though the goal is to capture reality, you know, the requirement is chiseling away, removing a lot to get to the essence of the story.
And that's where the fiction also comes in.
So once again, the fiction is in what's chiseled away.
There's a few photos.
Yeah, so I think you have a few of the people I interviewed. I started by interviewing my family, then I interviewed my first employers. This is one of my first employers, Raleigh. He's in issue 4. But then I found out that most of the people I worked with as a child had since retired from the industry. So then I interviewed, if you go one more, like the bigger growers. So when I was a kid, there was thousands of growers that were small family farms. They might have 1 or 2 acres, and they could make a lot of money from that. But then in the 1990s, Canada's to blame. At least in North America, no, I think in Europe too, but in North America, smoking was going out of fashion. And so the Canadian government offered huge tax incentives to tobacco growers to convert to a different crop. And in Ontario, most of them chose ginseng because it's a very similar geographical climate region. And it's a very lucrative crop. And overnight, they obliterated the family farmers in Wisconsin because suddenly you had large-scale, super mega corporate farmers producing this crop. And so they were able to destroy an entire small industry overnight. Which is what's happening to agriculture in any, produce or product. Yeah. And so now there's only a handful of big growers in my hometown, and this was one of them. They have gardens 1,000 times the size of the gardens I worked in as a child.
No. And it's the only way to survive.
It's the only way you can survive, yeah. And there's the middlemen, the distributors, the people that process the roots. There's the Ginseng Board of Wisconsin, which is, again, it's sort of like this corporate arm. They are almost a union in ways, but also a corporate arm, and they're trying to protect the branding of Wisconsin as a brand.
Yeah. The thing that brought you back to Wisconsin, in fact, was a ginseng festival.
Yes.
In fact, that was happening.
Yes.
Just to show you how important ginseng was. And here is
there's
Chua.
Chua Vang from, chapters 7 and 8. That was probably the best moments of working on the book was actually getting back out in the fields and doing the work again. Yeah. Obviously, it was not as strenuous as when I was a kid, because now I was just doing it for an hour or 2 for fun. Yeah. It's pretty cold that day, though.
As you mentioned, Chua Vang's father was a Hmong immigrant. And in the series as well, there is mention of the fact that once he gets to the US, he gets to go back to where you came from, which resounds really loud when reading it. But it is also a phrase you kind of use when starting off ginseng roots to talk about your own endeavor, go back where you came from, which is what the roots allude to.
Yeah, when I started the project, I had like this kind of hippie meditative moment. I had dug up a ginseng root from Wisconsin and I'd put it in a mason jar with alcohol. And I was spending some time with the root asking the question, what does this plant have to teach me? To try to step away from the human-centric narrative. And maybe I'm a crazy person, but very clearly I heard the root say, go back to where you came from, which is a phrase you associate with, say, Trump supporters and anti-immigration rhetoric, hate speech. You know, it's something they shout at immigrants, go back to where you came from. But when I heard it, it was more of a gentle self-reflection that that's the place I had to start the work. Because, again, like I said earlier, I'd spent my whole life fleeing where I came from. Maybe it was time to go back there and dig in the soil and try to figure out some sense of where I came from.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's Chua and I again. And that's a first-year garden, so that you can barely see the plants.
Yeah.
They're just the tiniest sprouts. That's in South Korea. I mentioned earlier Gumsan. It's the ginseng cultivation capital of the world. And that's in Jilin province, China. As is that. This man had like his prized wild roots, which is something I didn't write too much about in the book. I was focusing on cultivated ginseng. But cultivated ginseng has about 1/10 or less of the value of wild roots, which are very prized and valuable.
But it's very meticulous labor to get this out of the ground, right?
Yes, so like the hunters of wild roots say it takes 3 hours to very delicately extract the plant. Whereas the cultivated ginseng we work in, there was thousands of roots coming out of the ground every minute or hour. You know, they're being tilled out of the soil really rapidly, and there's a whole field of workers scrambling behind the tractor to pick up the roots. You can kind of see on the wall there in the background, they frame each ginseng like an art object.
Yeah.
They're quite expensive. And it was that same guy, Meng Qingbao is his name, who when we were visiting this shop in China, he was like, oh, do you want to see my Wisconsin ginseng? He had no idea we were from Wisconsin. He just was trying to brag to us, like, I have Wisconsin ginseng, because it is, in fact, the most prized ginseng in China.
Yeah. The fact of the matter is that when you were in Asia, you were being interviewed. I don't remember if it was in Korea
in
or
South Korea.
South Korea. You were being interviewed, and you learned that Chua, in fact, was being interviewed in Wisconsin, or had been interviewed.
So yeah, most of this book is me interviewing people, except in Asia, where the camera was reversed back on my brother and me, and we became the subjects of a documentary with a Korean television crew who was filming their own documentary about ginseng. And 2 weeks prior, they'd been in our hometown. What are the odds?
Yeah.
And they'd interviewed Chua. So that was actually the stepping stone for how I first met Chua. When I arrived at the Wisconsin Ginseng Festival, I recognized him from that documentary.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, we're in a documentary together. Oh, and here's that King Bao again, Meng Qingbao that you saw in the last panel. Yeah. He shows us his collection of Wisconsin roots, and I'm wondering if he knows which grower the roots came from in Wisconsin. And he's like, oh, no, these are grown in China. We've had Wisconsin seed here for 40 years. We've been producing Wisconsin ginseng for 40 years, which really calls into question, are those authentically Wisconsin ginseng roots?
No.
Are they bootlegs?
No. And I really love the question at the end. What does it mean to be authentic in an age of globalization? And I feel it also pertains to the series, Ginseng Roots itself. authenticity is to be found in that interconnectedness. We live in a globalized world, so yeah.
Yeah, and it pertains to that cultural appropriation question too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is Wisconsin ginseng being grown in China a form of cultural appropriation? Mm-hmm. Are these definitions important?
Absolutely. Who's this?
Scott Walker, Governor Scott Walker, who was a horrible man. And then on the far right here is Terry Guo, who's considered the Trump of Taiwan. He's the CEO of Foxconn, which is the world's largest electronics manufacturer. They make our iPhones. And they're the largest employer in China. When I was in Taiwan, I learned about then President Trump's connection with Wisconsin ginseng. And it was via Terry Guo. And this is them digging up the Wisconsin soil with their golden shovels because they were trying to establish a giant manufacturing plant in Wisconsin. It's gotten more tax subsidies than any other factory in US history. It was going to be a Taiwanese-owned company. This was one of Trump's ideas for reviving industry in America. It would have been a complete environmental disaster, as you might imagine, and it fell apart in the end. So it just gave billions of dollars to a corporation and took it away from the state taxpayers.
Yeah.
Oh, and
this is your...
Yeah, my rendition. And I should also specify that Ginseng Roots is born out of the collective trauma of Trump's 2016 election. I started writing the book in December 2016. And if you go to the next frame, and the reason is because Wisconsin had such a major role in Trump's election. It was 3 states, Pennsylvania. You and I saw a guy at the cafe who's wearing a Pennsylvania Farmers t-shirt. Yeah. But Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are 3 states that historically vote Democratic. And that year, they surprised everyone and flipped Republican. And they're not big populated states. They determined Trump's win by 80,000 votes. And historically, Wisconsin is very progressive. It's the birthplace of Social Security and welfare in America. It's the place where Global Earth Day was created in Wisconsin. Some of the great environmentalists came from there, like John Muir. It's a state of factory workers and farmers. Factory workers it's union members, which is socialist, which goes Democrat. And farmers are self-employed, and they're opposed to the corporations and corporate farming. So they also go Democrat. So it was a surprise to everybody that they flipped that year. And so that was part of the motivation for the book, too, to try to understand energetically what was happening in that part of the country.
Yeah, yeah. Because there's also a lack of reality within his thinking. He's mentioning there is nobody like the American worker. At the same time, you're confronted with American workers that no longer want to work in the fields.
Yeah, the context of that page is one of the farmers saying, oh, we have to use Mexican laborers because nobody here is willing to work. So there's a great irony there.
So this is kind of an overview. You can't see the 12th issue.
Yeah, I think I took this photo before the 12th issue was out. Yeah. But those are the 12 issues of the series, which we have here today. Yeah.
I'm just looking at the time. We still have a quarter of an hour. I don't know if we should shift to questions from the public, or do I just continue, or do I let the slideshow pass while you ask? And are there any questions for Graig?
We do both together.
Yeah. No questions yet? Just yell out if you have one, okay? So we'll continue, because I added this picture to see, well, you see the serialized form of ginseng roots.
Yeah, I guess that goes full circle with what I was saying earlier, that when Blankets came out, I was sick of the comic book format, and I wanted to make a book, which was at that time pretty unprecedented in the US. And now 20 years later, I actually wanted to go back to the comic book format.
Yeah. when going back to blankets and wanting to create that giant volume, you were inspired, especially by this endeavor by Louis Trondheim?
Yeah, this was, this book came out, I think, in 1997 in France, and this was the object that I wanted to copy. And it's the only version I'd seen of that, because there were some quote-unquote graphic novels before that, but they were collections. So Mouse by R. Spiegelman was serialized in RAW. Jamie Corrigan by Chris Ware came out in 2000, but it was serialized as comic books. There wasn't yet this movement of just doing a book, except for this. This is the one thing I had seen. And it was the French cartoonist Louis Trondheim, who claimed he didn't know how to draw. And it's true, he didn't know how to draw before starting this book. He challenged himself to draw 500 pages. And figuring that, and it's all improvisational. It's all made up as he goes along. And his goal was like, either I'll learn how to draw by the end of this, or I'll get it out of my system and give up on that dream. But instead, he became a great drawer, and probably the most prolific cartoonist in France, or maybe Europe.
Yeah.
And so yes, I had this book, and I wanted to make an object like that. I took on the same challenge of drawing 500 pages, and every time I would finish a page, I'd put a little bookmark in Louis's Lapignon to know where I was, working towards my goal.
Wow, beautiful. Here are two.
Oh, and then thematically, these were all other French cartoonists that I really drew inspiration from. And both of these books came out in the late 90s, 1990s too. And Baudouin's Pierrot, 1998. So looking back on these books, I mean, I remember that they were books that I was inspired by, but then looking back, I was surprised how much I ripped them off. So Edmond Baudouin's book is about growing up with his little brother, who he would draw together with, and he shared a bed with. And then in Bluch's Le Petit Christian, which is also a little memoir, you can see him wandering around his grandmother's bedroom and getting a little scared by this portrait of Jesus, which is very similar to the image in Blankets. Yeah. And then here's another scene where his mother's forcing them to eat their meat, which is what my father would do to us. So I was surprised to revisit those books and see that I had pretty overtly ripped them off. But it wasn't conscious. No. I was a young cartoonist, and that's like the age where you wear your influences on your sleeve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there must be comic book artists who have taken Blankets as an inspiration. Yeah. So Blankets. I think a lot of people here have read Blankets.
Blankets is still my best known work, and over the years, the publishers and readers have pressured me to do do a sequel to Blankets, which I never wanted to do, because I didn't want to repeat myself. So it's funny that in spite of my own intentions, Ginseng Roots ended up being a form of sequel to Blankets.
Yeah. Here's a few pages to just give an insight in the process leading up to your books, in this case, Blankets. This is very early on.
And I guess if you go back to that last image, that it illustrates that like my books always start in my sketchbooks. On the left there is like the very first sketchbook page I ever wrote about Blankets in 1997. And already I drew a scene that emerged in the book. And I had the title right from the start. In fact, I didn't start writing Blankets for another 2 years.
Wow.
I worked on my first book, Goodbye Chunky Rice. Yeah. Once that went off to press, I picked up a sketchbook again, and that's the first page I drew a couple years later. And again, it has scenes that showed up in the book. So it's pretty weird when I'm doing that sketchbook process that the scenes emerge organically right away.
Yeah. Here, concerns or frustrations with Blankets?
Oh, yeah. Here this is like only like a month or so into working on Blankets, where I list my concerns about autobiography. Yeah. One is fear of hurting other people. when to divert from the truth and when to be journalistic about what happened, egocentric, fear of boring readers with details of my life, fear that the themes and this is very intimate. This is my diary, by the way. I know. Fear that the themes and topics I'm trying to tackle will be lost or watered down while paying attention to mundane details of life. Stories are allowed to be subtle. I don't know what I'm saying there exactly.
But since Chunky was already...
So I just was worried, like,
lacking
where
in
am I going to
plot.
find a story in real life? Real life is not really that structured. It's kind of amorphous. So all of those fears proved true. I mean, you know, it's still something I struggle with. And yet I'm compelled to do memoir.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is just an example, again, of like my earliest sketchbooks. I am already drawing scenes that end up emerging years later in final pages.
Yeah. I think I would like to proceed a bit to like the pages you... I'm sorry.
That was my little brother and I,
Yeah.
the original inspiration for Blankets.
I think I integrated the originals from there.
Oh,
you
there,
go.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just, we just threw these in at the last minute to
Yeah.
show just the process of drawing a page. This isn't necessarily a favorite page of mine, but I happen to have photos of process. So I still work analog on paper, which is important to me. That's an example of what the pencils for a page look like. And you can kind of see the scale. I ink everything with a watercolor brush dipped in India ink, pretty old school. One thing I learned at this art schools I've been visiting in Europe is that Europeans value analog artwork a lot more than America. Like if you go to schools in the US, the kids all do digital, almost primarily digital. But I think there's still a reverence for old school techniques here.
And you don't have that in the States?
No, the States, the most cartoonists these days are digital. So I'm one of the old guard, you know, like that values these old tools. Yeah. I always compare it to cobblery. Like it's this old world skill. Like why would you dip a brush in an inkwell, you know? Why would you cobble shoes? But, you know, it's like old world techniques. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's the same page as more detail accumulates. And then the final page. Again, not my favorite page in the book, but it's one that I actually documented.
Yeah. And it illustrates your fear of empty spaces.
Yeah. When I was trying to capture like the density and movement of the forest. And I remember when I was doing research with a Chinese medicine practitioner, and we went into the forest, and I would try to take a photo, and I would tell him like, oh, it like doesn't work. You can't photograph the forest. It's impossible. Like it's weird. We don't have the technology to photograph nature because like there is something like energetic, and there's something about what the human eye's perception does in those spaces that at least my phone camera wasn't able to capture. And I don't think my drawing necessarily did either, but I was trying to get into that, like, capturing all the different movements and sounds and density. Because really, the forest is hyper dense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here is...
Oh, that's like Blankets era, Craig.
Yeah.
When I still had hair.
A few pages from Blankets. This is from Ginseng Roots.
Yeah, so this shows that, like, I circle back to a lot of the same themes in Blankets. I'm focusing on agriculture, which was only a single panel in Blankets, but I'm also touching again on religion. I talk a bit about being homeschooled as a kid. And this is a baptism scene. If you go ahead, I think there's photos of my baptism. There I am. And then the pastor plunging me into the muddy river that flowed through our hometown. And then there's how I depicted it in Ginseng Roots.
the funny thing is, this is also in ginseng roots. And
That this is?
yeah.
Oh, yeah, so this actually circles back to both two things that I said. One was about how America is a place that erases its past. And it's also about Chua Vang's story. His father fled Laos during the war. And when he came to America, he tried to erase the past and reinvent himself. He changed his name from Ga Yi Vang to Abraham, a biblical name. And he even became a pastor at a Baptist church. And he forsook the animist like faith that the Hmong people came from, and performed baptisms. But this was his father's line that like when he came to America, he tried to wash away the past, which is what the baptism represents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're creating circles here.
There's a lot of circles in the book.
Yeah. So
Any questions from the audience, or yes?
I was wondering if it was kind of difficult to use color since you always use black and white.
Okay, so is it difficult to use color because I mostly use black and white? Yeah, well, black and white is my preference, and the market seems to prefer color, and this was sort of a compromise for me and a chance to try something new. I was, in terms of inspiration, I was looking at like Chinese woodcut prints, and they usually use a red color along with the black or gray ink. So that was like the primary visual inspiration. Of course, red is a very symbolic color in Chinese art in general. We associate it with, you know, Mao's Red Book and Chinese propaganda. Also, all of the commercial marketing of ginseng always has red, and I was using the red in terms of graphic design in the book. I was using like old school printing techniques that I got really nerdy about, of overprinting gray tones with red tones to make sepia tones, which evoked the nostalgia of old photographs from the 70s and 80s. And also the berries or the seeds that come out on ginseng plants at the end of summer and the beginning of fall are these vibrant crimson red. And it was like perfect to have that tool of the red ink to make that pop out of the page. So it was really just an opportunity to try something new that I hadn't done, which I try to do with every book. Thanks.
Other questions?
Yes?
When you're in the early stages of a book, trying to decide which ideas end up in the story and which don't make it, how much of that is planning and outlining, and how much of that is more discovered as you go?
Oh, good question. So yeah, when I'm working on the book, and how much of it is like outlined and planned ahead of time, and how much is discovered as I go along. Sorry to summarize really quickly. So yeah, with all my books, I do an outline. With all my books, I do a storyboard where I try to work out all the problems, both in the words and pictures, before I start drawing the final art. But I've never known how to finish a book before I started it, which is true with every one of my projects. And they tell you is the opposite way to work. They say that you're supposed to start with the ending and work backwards. I've never known how to end a book. And I think I need that time, the hours and days and years of working and drawing and meditating for things to emerge more organically. And maybe I need the problem and the threat. It's like for free solo climbers that don't want to have the ropes. I'm like, I need a little risk involved to make it to keep me going somehow. Or I'm not smart enough to know the ending before I get there. And in the case of both Ginseng Roots and Blankets, which are memoirs, there were still scenes I hadn't lived in real time until I lived them while working on the book that I then wrote into the series. Down to the wire, down to the last minute of like, oh, I just lived this last week, but I think it has to be in the book. And with ginseng roots, the biggest thing was like my health crisis, hand health crisis. I decided to include that in the narrative, and it was really a big piece that was missing. Thanks.
Any more? Oh, yeah.
You mentioned the challenges you had in the US with publishers due to the subject matters of your work. I don't think the concept of banned books is coming across in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But do you see like similar hesitation with publishers due to the topics you bring in your books?
Yes, definitely. I think you have an image about this too. Oh, there. Wow.
There you go.
Perfect timing for Kurt's image. Yeah, blankets has been a subject of book bans since the beginning, but it's been worse in the last 2 or 3 years. The entire state of Utah has banned blankets. The beginning of last year, I spoke with Sandy Hook, the community of Sandy Hook, which had a school shooting massacre 13 years ago where 14 students and teachers were killed. And in those 13 years since, they've been trying to pass state laws to ban assault rifles unsuccessfully. Assault rifles are still allowed in Sandy Hook, but blankets is not. It's banned. And so the community asked me to talk to the town hall digitally on Zoom. And as the event approached, they got cold feet. They almost were going to cancel the event because they said, this crowd is really angry and they want to burn you at the stake. And because of the violence directed at you, the author, we don't want you to see or have access to the audience. You'll only see me, the moderator, Kurt, and any questions will be fielded through the assistants up to me so that we can control what's happening here in this town hall meeting. And I was like, wow, why are they so upset? And he said, well, your book is considered child pornography here. And I was like, well, like why? And I thought he might mention scenes of teenage, quote unquote, sexuality. But in fact, he said, well, the scene that they're most upset about is the pee fight. There's a scene in Blankets where my little brother and I get involved in a fight of peeing on each other, which I've always thought of as pure comedic relief in the middle of a sentimental story. But apparently that was the most, that was what people were most upset about and were perceiving as child pornography, which didn't enter my mind in a million years that someone could read that scene that way. Part of the problem is that graphic novels are, now they're seen as a kid's medium again. I think cartoonists sort of created this format of the graphic novel to legitimize comics for adult literary readers, and ironically, it just created an explosion of like kid readers that love this format. And now in the US, I would say 95% of graphic novels are for children. And it's hard to find a place for adult literary content. And that's why it's a real easy target for censorship. Is that the whole question? I forgot if I missed something there.
Do you see similar hesitation appearing in Europe or elsewhere in the world, or is it still typically?
No. I don't know. I don't live here, but I don't sense the same. Being in Europe, I feel a lot more encouraged and protected as an artist. And for some reason, the arts have been a targeted battleground for the cultural and political divide happening in the US. And it's not just the right wing. It's the right wing that's doing these kind of Nazi-era book bans, but it's also the left wing that is really trying to censor the sort of stories we're allowed to tell. And, so again, I guess I talked about my career, midlife crisis, and a lot of it was just getting constant criticism from all directions, all the time, and I didn't know how to turn off those voices. Thank you. Yes?
Hi. You've told us about how you've been homeschooled and really couldn't pursue an art education, yet right now your drawings are very masterful. I was wondering, how did you learn to draw? Did you have a master,
Okay. So yeah, despite not going to university and being homeschooled my final year of high school, how did I learn to draw? Well, I started to draw before I was in school. So it was, I actually learned first from, I said earlier that I didn't get to grow up around my relatives, but I remember once meeting one of my cousins as a kid back in Michigan, and they drew Snoopy, and my mind was blown. I didn't know human beings could draw. I didn't know that drawings came from human beings. And I very easily learned how to draw Snoopy, and then that was my first obsession. So then, whatever age that was, 4 or 5, I started obsessively drawing. And then, I don't know, I think I'm still learning how to draw. It's just practice, just a lot of hours spent. The Louis Trondheim exercise I mentioned of drawing 500 pages. He was trying to teach himself how to draw by sitting down and drawing 500 pages. I took on the same challenge, and it worked. I did become a better drawer during that time. That's the only great answer I have.
It's putting in the hours.
Yeah, and I'm still very close friends with my English teacher in art school. So when I was in art school, my favorite class was English. So that kind of explains where I felt I belonged within that community. I wanted more to be a storyteller than an image maker.
Thank you so much for the questions.
Yes, thank you.
I think we're about to go over time. And I
we
think
want time to sign some books too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Graig.
Yeah, and depending on the line, I mean, even I'll probably be primarily stamping and personalizing books, because you'll learn because of some hand issues I have, and also make sure we can do something for everyone. So
yeah, absolutely. So have fun. The book stand is just outside, as you've seen. And thanks so much for joining us here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kurt.